One day I walked into my office, and sitting on my desk was a copy of Nan's Kolbe. And this was after she had passed away. And Nan worked at our office for a while, and people were cleaning stuff out and thought instead of throwing away, maybe they would give it to me. And, you know, I knew that she had her Kolbe during her life, but never really looked at it. And I remember walking into my office and picking it up and just sitting down and looking at it and thinking, "Oh, boy, so much makes sense," you know? Um, so those of you who are listening who don't know what the Kolbe is, it's a way to look at how people naturally approach the world. So in our minds, there's three parts. There's our affective, how do we feel? There's cognitive, our smarts, our brain. But that connotation is, our natural instincts and how we do that. And that's what the Kolbe looks at. So if I was facing a problem, how would I naturally look at that? How would I naturally resolve that? And in Nan's situation, there's so many times after somebody that you've cared for and loved passes away that you have these moments that are really, really hard. Um, and this moment when I walked into my office, although I really appreciate my staff person giving it to me, it really kinda took me back, and, of course, I cried a little, looking at it, but, um, I, uh, I thought to myself, "Gosh, it makes so much sense." Now, interesting for our listeners, she actually has the same Colby as my husband, and that makes me laugh now because there was times when we would have conflict or have to be, like, doing things or solving a problem, and her and Donald would, like, align themselves, because and again, it makes sense now because they sorted the world in the same way, which was very different than I did. And so Colby's something that I use at my office to develop teams, but it's also something that I think can really be used in this caregiving journey. And that's why I wanted to spend some time today talking about it.
So, welcome everyone to the Hey Woman podcast. So, my name's Courtney. I'm here with my mom, Julie. And so, we both work in an elder law firm, and we're here to talk about kind of our journey with Nan through caregiving. We're also both Kolbe Certified Consultants. So, we have survived training in Phoenix. The training is lovely, but they do it in August.
Yeah,
And so,
the last time, yeah, not lovely.
so we both survived, the over 100-degree heat. And so that we really believe in this because we kind of
Mm.
put ourselves out there for that kind of weather. But the Colby is something that, we use both in the law firm and also with our coaching clients. And so I think, it's really important to talk about it today in the caregiving journey, and it's not something we had really thought about using before, but I think there's some really interesting, plays there. I love the way that they talk about, how people operate and problem solve. I also really appreciate the way that they approach conflict using Colby, because conflict is a natural part of life. People think conflict is hard, or it's bad, but really it's just a normal part of any process. And with something as, kind of high stress as the caregiving process with all of the different emotions that you could go through, it's really important to have the tools to kind of work through conflict. Because if you just sweep everything under the rug, it just kind of comes back out later at maybe a less opportune time to kind of deal with it. And so with Colby, there's four parts, and we're going to kind of talk about each of them. But I think what's important for people to know is that if we looked at you and I's Colby, the Colby report would actually say we're in high conflict.
It would, yes.
So, it's something that high conflict's not bad. It just means that you and I sort the world differently. Doesn't mean we can't work together. Clearly we do.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean we can't caregive together because we do. But it just means that there's going to be times when you're better at solving a problem than I am.
Well,
Um,
or that you're gonna do it in a different way, and really understanding that, allows us not to think, one person's lazy or they never do anything, which happens a lot in families. Like, why isn't that person doing more? Well, they might be doing a lot. They're just doing something different. Like, so
Right.
when that crisis hits, one person's running to facts, the other person's running to, brainstorming solutions. And we'll talk about the different parts. But I think it really has a fantastic place at the base of caregiving so that family units can understand and develop respect for the other people and not be upset by how people do approach a problem differently.
And, I think one of the best things that Colby says, and this is so true in caregiving, is that while you have a natural MO, is what they call it. You have a
Hmm.
natural mode of operations, a natural way that you would choose to solve problems when left to your own devices. There's kind of 12 modes. You can operate in any of the modes. It just takes more energy to work against your natural problem solving. And I see that a lot. So I'm not naturally what they call a quick start, which is how you deal with risk and uncertainty. And as an accountant, I think, my clients appreciate that I maybe don't take a lot of risk, right? So I'm lower on that. And I think and you're very high on the quick start. And so what that means is that doesn't mean I can't deal with risk and uncertainty. It just means that if I'm in a situation where I have to rapid make a bunch of decisions very quickly, that's not how I would choose to solve a
Mhm.
problem.
You would rather the status quo.
Yes, I would.
Mhm, and there's nothing wrong with that because I would jump to make a bunch of decisions, and I think balancing each other out is helpful.
It is because, as Nan would say, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Mhm.
And sometimes that's important, right? It's important to, in caregiving, if there's a crisis, it's important to have somebody that's willing to stabilize, but it's also important to understand that there are some parts of this that have to be changed. And so balancing that, but if those two people are arguing, you have to understand that they're both doing what they feel like is in the best interest of the person that they're caring for. They just really operate differently.
Right, absolutely.
And so I think that understanding is really important. So before we get too deep into kind of some applications, I think it's important to talk about what they are. So there's a fact finder. So that's how you deal with information, how much information.
And just so everybody knows, they're on a scale from 1 to 10, and 1 isn't bad, 10's not bad, it's just that everybody's gonna be somewhere along that mode, and in the higher the number in the fact-finding mode, the more facts somebody needs, the more specific they're gonna be, and again, we're generalizing a little bit on here, but just so kind of everybody understands, everybody needs a certain amount of facts. Like, for me, I'm a 5, so I need facts, but I don't need as many facts as you need.
Right, I'm a 7.
Right.
And what's interesting about the 5 kind of in the middle is you can kind of, jump to my 7 easier than maybe
Mhm.
somebody that's like a 2 or a 3. That's a large number to jump, right?
Mhm.
But what I find is that sliding from a 5 to a 7 may not take as much. So, people don't have to be exactly your number, but the closer the numbers are together, the closer that you're going to problem solve together. I also think that's really important for people to know. You don't also just want a whole bunch of people that problem solve the same way you do, because that can also cause problems, which, could say that you're all going to make the same decisions. You're all going to make them kind of in the same way. Well, sometimes you have to inject, new things, new ideas. If you're a family full of like, 7, 8, 9 and fact find, you're just going to fact find yourself to death.
Yeah,
Like,
you're
you know
never
what I
gonna
mean?
actually make a decision, you're just gonna keep researching and
Right.
keep finding out more, so, in the caregiving journey, that can be like, mom needs more help or mom needs to go to a facility, and how much am I gonna research those facilities? And I'll just keep researching, but never, like, kinda make a choice, and
Right.
so that's what can happen at a high fact finding, particularly if everybody on that group or team, has that.
And then the next is follow through. And that's how you deal with processes. So people that are higher in the follow through, so I'm a 7, mean that they're going to create processes. They like to make processes. So that would be why, like, these are the people that are thinking through the logistics of caregiving. These are the people that are doing the scheduling, or when you have a problem, they're the people that are organizing a meal train or something like that. They're naturally going to create a system or a process that people can follow. This is the person that's making the checklist. So every time you visit your loved one, you have things that you have to do. That's what this person's going to do.
And I'm a 3, so, I'm not gonna make the checklist. I'm gonna want to just use whatever checklist there is there that somebody else has used, and that's where sometimes people could think, well, like, Court could do all this work, and she could say, "Well, why is mom not doing it? She's lazy or she's not helping." I actually am, but I'm spending my time more on looking at your facts and figuring out what the solution should be, so I'm gonna be spending more of my mode of operation in that I'm gonna, initiate in my quick start more, which is, okay, is this going to work? What's the next step? What if the caregiving doesn't work? Do we need to go to a facility? Those types of things. Like, I'm still spending my time. I'm just spending it in a different way. I'm just going to accept your system and use your system, and not change it, because that's not my thing. So again, I think that's really important for people to hear, because I think sometimes siblings get so, like, what I find in my occupation is that siblings get so mad at each other, because they're not perceiving that they're pulling the same weight, and that could be true.
That
Like,
could be true.
it could be true. I'm not saying, but I also think sometimes it's just that they're initiating a different mode of operation. They're moving forward in a different way, and they're not. So I'm not being lazy when I'm not building a system. It's not my thing. I'm not good at it. Now, can I? Of course. And did I sometimes for Nan?
Sure.
Yes, I did. I had to arrange in-home care. I had to build that system around it. But it did take a lot of my energy because I don't often think through all of those details. And so again, I can do it, but not my natural. I'm happy if somebody comes in and systematizes it for me.
Right. Well, and I think, the point that you made, which is you're willing to follow the system.
Hmm.
I also think, there's a balance here too of you can't just keep making more and more and more systems. You can't system yourself out of caregiving, right?
Hmm.
Um, and there are going to be people on the follow through spectrum that are going to shorten your system. And sometimes we have to listen to them too,
Hmm.
because maybe your checklist has 25 steps. Maybe it only needs 12, right?
Right.
And so if you have a sibling or loved one or something like that that's objecting to the checklist that you made, there are people who naturally simplify things. And maybe you do need all 25
Mhm.
steps, and it's important to explain that to the person.
And as a
Um
3, I'm gonna do that also.
Right. But maybe you don't. Maybe you only need 12. And so it doesn't mean that they're being lazy or that they don't want to do all of the steps or they don't want to care for the person. It just means that naturally they're trying to simplify it to get what it is just needs to be done.
Mhm.
And so I think that's important too, is that, that it can feel, as the person that created the system, it can feel jarring when somebody comes in and says, "Oh, we don't need to do all of this because you spent all of this time."
One, it might be laminated. It's probably on an Excel spreadsheet that has 5 tabs, all of which I'm not gonna look at, but yes.
Well, and I think that's important. I know you're not looking at them. So I'm not offended, right? Like I actually think that's really important. We're in high conflict in that
Mhm.
area. But it's not bad. I know you're not looking at them, but you also know that I needed them. So you
Mhm.
let me make my 5 tabs and then I summarize it all for you on the first tab.
Mhm.
And that's how we get through that high level of conflict, is that I need them, you don't, but you respect respect that it took me time to get that because that was my process.
Yeah. And I think, just so everybody knows, there's a lot of applicability. We've talked about organizing in home care. We've talked about moving to a facility, but even end of life decisions. Like people are going to, some people are going to have to talk to the doctor and get the facts, and others are going to be farther into the system where they're like, I'm okay with it, or I just don't need as many facts. And again, the point that we're trying to make is that all of that's okay.
Yep.
And everybody should get what they need, and of course, the person in the bed, the person that's sick, they also might need, I very much knew, although I was a little jarred by getting Nan's Kolbe, I knew that we were opposite in some ways. The thing I didn't know, and we'll get to about the implementer, was how much of an implementer she was, but gosh, it makes so much sense. But I knew like she was more like you in the building systems and the fact finding, and not a quick start like I am. And I honored that. I knew that even though I didn't want to explain it to her, that I had to,
Mhm.
that she needed those facts. And so when we did what's the PULSE, the physician's ordered life-sustaining treatment, in some states it's called a MOLST, medical order of life-sustaining treatment. That's a document that's used when somebody's in a facility, if they're going to be transferred to the hospital and maybe they want some things still done, but not really extraordinary measures. And it's a doctor's order. And, doing that with Nana, um, was definitely a situation where I had to put my Kolbe in my back pocket and understand she needed what she needed. She needed to ask questions. The person who came from hospice and palliative care was wonderful, met with her 3 separate times, answered all of her questions, had Nan be able to, ask everything she needed. And I very much in that circumstance honored that that's what my mom needed, even though I didn't. Like I really didn't. And I felt like some of it was like, we've already talked about this, but she needed, and this was her life. Like it was her decision. That also allowed me, when we got to the point where we were putting that into, really putting that into play, we were honoring what that said, which was not having her be rushed off to the hospital. I knew it's what she wanted, and I knew she understood it. And that allowed me to be able to defend that, like, allowed me to be able to be like, no, like, I'm sure this is what she wanted because I'd been through that process with her. If I had circumvented that process, I may have, when in that moment, not felt as comfortable. And that's the value and the gift of Kolbe, and understanding that we're all different human beings. And this is something we want to be thinking about. And even if, I'm sure as you're listening, we're talking about caregiving. I use this in my office. It also has a lot of applicability, like raising children
With your
with
spouse.
your spouse. My husband and I have different Colbys, and understanding that he's not just being a pain in my butt, but that he does have a different mode of operation. He's going to, initiate problem solving in a different manner than I am. Is really helpful. So there's lots of things that this is helpful for. So the next mode, so we've already talked about fact finding, which is the first one on the chart. It's red, and again, all of these are 1 to 10. All Colbys are good. There's nothing that's bad. The second is the follow through that we talked about with the systems, and then the third is the quick start. And that's where I am a quick start. So I'm very high on that. And that means that if I'm sitting down in a meeting and there's a problem, or if I was standing in the ICU waiting room, I'm going to jump into solving that problem by brainstorming solutions. I'm going to be the person that's like, has all these ideas, like, right? Doesn't mean they're all good ideas. It also doesn't mean that we don't have to do the research, the fact finding, or create a system. But in that moment, I'm going to be not risk adverse. I'm going to be willing to, jump off the building and look for my parachute after I jump. And that again, sometimes people will look at that as me being more lazy, and I'm not at all. But I also have to honor that some people aren't as high on a quick start as I am, so they don't feel as comfortable with that. And so it might take them more to like jump off the roof. Like they might have to check their parachute 7 times, find out where it was manufactured, all kinds of types of things. But honestly, too, when we think about caregiving and moving to a facility, I might be more quick to say, okay, here's 7 options that we have, and really focus on those options and kind of move one forward, where somebody else may be, I need to know more about every, 7 of those options, and kind of, spend more time initiating and researching and fact finding. And that again, if you're standing in, the ICU waiting room and you have a sibling or somebody who just keeps asking a lot of questions and needing a lot of facts, they're not being difficult. They really need that. And I think that's what we want people to hear.
Is that yeah, I mean, so also that all of the ideas can be overwhelming to people who aren't high on the quick start, and what I've really had to learn is that, I'm gonna have to let you quick start because the ideas will be good, but I don't have to fact find all of them.
Right.
So I think that's one of the biggest thing is that I'm either I can initiate in facts or in processes, but just because you said 7 facilities doesn't mean I have to research all 7 facilities, right, to make those decisions. So I think that's important
Yeah,
to
you could push me back to prioritize my ideas, which a
right.
lot of times you do, and to, and make me think deeper about them. So if I said 7, maybe I could come up with 3 that I thought were the best and reasons why, and then you could spend your time in those 3.
Right, and both processes are important. But
Right.
I think if you are, always, if you have a sibling who's like, I'm overwhelmed by this. Well, if you think about it at the root, caregiving is change. It
Yes.
is large changes over and over and over again. And for somebody that doesn't like risk, that doesn't like uncertainty, that is just like a whole pile of like, I'm just expending all kinds of energy doing things that I don't naturally do.
Right.
And sometimes you have to check yourself because you can't get all the facts. You can't process your way out of it. You can't fact
Well, because
find.
it could change before you fact find. Like,
Right.
all of a sudden, now we're dealing with something else. You're right.
Right. So, like, I mean, the facts are changing so fast, things are changing. So, I think, amongst caregivers, that's really important to understand that I just might, and it's really hard to do, but like, I just might have to be uncomfortable with what's happening for a little bit
Mhm.
until everybody gets their feet under them. But I think the thing for Nan is, Nan's lower on the quick start. And so, when we talk about all these changes that are happening, you're talking about her sitting in her discomfort.
Yes.
And so it's one thing for me to do it as a caregiver who understands that, like, who can intellectually understand that this is a Kolbe and I'm going to be uncomfortable for this, but it's going to be okay because I trust the people making the decisions, that they're making the right and best decisions. And I'll be able to sit at my phone tonight and fact find until my heart's content and I can get myself like there. But for the person that it's happening to, it can be really hard. And sometimes you do have to balance. Maybe I do have to slow it down. And this is where like it's great if you have support or help. If you're the high quick start caregiver and you also have another caregiver who's lower who also needs all the facts, well, let them go fact find together, right?
Yes.
Like it doesn't have to be you because you're going to be expending your energy doing something that isn't natural to you, isn't what you normally would like to do. And so that's where I think it's really important to, if you guys all have your Colbys and the person who you're caregiving for has them, you can kind of assign out tasks,
Mhm.
to people who are more naturally going to do that. So like, I was out of town, but for those meetings that you talked about with Nan with the pulse form, there is an argument that I would have been better in those meetings than you because it wouldn't have bothered me to have the same conversation 3 times.
Right,
Um,
exactly. The only problem there is I was in person,
right.
and it was happening then, and so I needed to, honor what Nan needed at that point in time. But I think also important sometimes, the person that's going to the hospital or is doing that caregiving, and then all the other family wants to know about it, they want reported back. that can become really hard for a caregiver. It's a lot of energy that you're expending retelling the story. And I think one of the things that we did well was talking amongst everybody so that I didn't have to talk to everybody individually. And I think sometimes when families are fractured, they make it harder on that caregiver who is like front line because they have to give all the updates. Like for me, there's nothing worse than going to the hospital, dealing with all that has to, Nan broke her hip. And then I'm at the hospital, and then people are calling me, asking me for an update, and then asking me for facts that I don't know. Um, and it's like, for me, and I talk to my clients about this, that's why sometimes, even if one person is going to be making the decisions, like a healthcare power of attorney, maybe more family members should get a HIPAA release
Mhm.
so they can talk directly to the doctor. So you're not asking that caregiver who is exhausted, spending their days in the hospital to then make all these phone calls at night. Now, I do think texting has really helped with that. So being able to send out a text to all the grandchildren to say, hey, this is what's going on. That was really helpful instead of me having to have 6 separate conversations or 5 separate conversations. And so I think like even this has a lot of applicability on transferring information. And I think sometimes we don't realize if particularly if there's one caregiver who is like front lines and then they're having to tell the story again and again. I think that's important. And if you're listening and you're that caregiver, I think it's okay to ask other people to say, hey, I'm going to tell this one other person. And then that person has to tell everybody
Yeah.
else. Or we're going to just text a certain amount. And if you want to know more, call the doctor yourself or call this other person. Like, can somebody else help shoulder that load? And maybe a fact finding person is the best person to do that. Now, remember, I'm a 5 on a fact find, so I do like my facts. It's not like I don't. And so, I would get a good amount of facts. It's not like I was a 1, 2, 3 where, that specificity wasn't important at all to me.
But it's also important to know if you're talking to somebody who is a 1, 2, 3, and you can overwhelm them with
Mhm.
information that they just didn't need, and then you're retelling a story that maybe you didn't have to. So I also think, the applicability there, we talk about not giving people enough information. You can also give people too much information. And so that's where I think it's really important to understand where people are coming from. The last, section of the Kolbe is the implementer.
Mhm.
And that's really how you deal with tangible things. And so I am a 4 an implementer. So like kind of like 1, 2, 3, they can envision things. So they see things kind of in their head and different things like that. In the middle, you kind of go like both ways. But people that are like 7 to 10, they really like things like tangible. Like they like to touch things, hold things, print it out. These are like my dad is really high in an implementer. He works in construction. So like that
Yep.
makes sense.
Demolition, excavating,
Uh,
yes. Mhm.
so like these are people that like working with their hands. What's interesting about Nan's high on the implementer, and the
She
way that
was.
that makes sense to me is she always printed things out because she had to
Mhm.
touch it.
Yes.
So like and this would be really hard. This is kind of a combination of some Kolbe things here, but like for Nan, when you paid her bills, you had to like copy the check and you had to write it out. And it was this whole thing. And it was very pen and paper. And you could argue that some of that is, her age and her time and that she didn't use a computer. Not 100% true, like, you know what I mean?
Mhm.
Like, she definitely like, she worked at your office, she was, semi-comfortable using a computer, but I really think it was her Kolbe coming out in that she tangibly liked to like, I remember when I did her tax return one year, like, I printed it out and went over with her, like, she wanted to hold it, like, she wanted to, do things with it. I also think that's important for, caregivers to understand when they are trying to like explain things to them, picking up brochures and pamphlets. If somebody's like in the middle there on an implementer, they may want to actually tangibly hold the pamphlet. And they're not being difficult, but the online pictures just don't really do it for them.
So when you talk about it, building, things to talk about it, being more visual about it. I think in Nan, I think about, growing up with her, and there was times that, my dad wasn't really into fixing things, but my mom could fix pretty much anything, and that's kinda coming out, like, she's a very hands-on. If the toilet wasn't working, she was gonna fix the toilet, and I know how to fix all kinds of things, even though I'm not as high on her as her, but I think this is where, Dom Lafredo, who works for us, always talks about it, and I think in a really neat way where Kolbe isn't, it's our conation, it's how we naturally process the world, but because we have the affective and the cognitive, like, in a situation, I know how to fix things because I grew up with Nan, and I cognitively can figure it out, and effectively, I don't mind doing it, like, right? So, but I think that's interesting. I think, with Nan, and her and Donald, my husband, being so high on that implementer, if we were doing something like landscaping outside, that's why the 2 of them would agree, or we were buying furniture, like, they had to go see it, they couldn't buy it online. It's just really interesting to me now, to look back and think, gosh, there was times in my life that the 2 of them who often would kibitz with each other,
Mhm.
and pick on each other a bit, could align themselves quite nice, and that that string of commonality is that implementer in them, which I think is really interesting how, they have these similar Colbys, and that's how they work. And I think too, again, with Nan, that's why, like, she had to look at that pulse form. We had to, and even Jody, when she talked to her, when you had some props and things so that mom could really understand what would happen if she had CPR, and could really kind of, really feel comfortable with her decisions. And at the end of the day, I mean, part of this podcast is for those of you who are caregiving out there to understand, maybe getting help in a way. Like, unfortunately, when you're caregiving, you're often overwhelmed, and maybe some of that is you're working against your natural conation. Maybe some of it is that you're not really a quick start and you don't like change, and so you haven't accepted that life has changed. I think one of the biggest things for me in all of this was being able to accept that I was in a certain chapter of my life. And so even if I wanted to do some things, that I just wasn't going to have time to do them. Or like at my office, like my calendar just had to be changed. So, Nan was gonna get a shower in the morning. So
Yes.
I told her she shouldn't. I told her she should wait. She was not going to. She was gonna get up and take her shower. And so, just moving my schedule to start at 9 o'clock instead of 8 o'clock on certain days was able to accommodate that. And I think sometimes because I was more able, as a quick start, to accept change and just kind of put that into my schedule, um, and just like, that's the way it has to be. This is the solution, like, right? I think when people don't see that, or they think it's for some reason, we think it's temporary, and I get that we might think it's temporary because we want it to be temporary. I mean, there's also this whole emotional baggage of how we feel about this and accepting that this is where we're at. But I guess my encouragement to everybody out there, I hope that this episode has helped you in some ways understand that it's hard, but there could be solutions. There could be a better understanding of who you are, who you're co-caregiving with, the person that you're taking care of. And hopefully, what it's done for me is it's helped me. Colby has helped me build a team of people at my law office that work quite well together. It's also helped me, to really respect and understand the differences in people that I get to work with and people that I love. And so I encourage you to think about, learning a little bit more about Colby, and kind of helping that implement your life. And maybe it can help with some of the overwhelm and feeling so exhausted.
Yeah, I think, information is always powerful. And so, just understanding, I think the best way that Colby does it is about energy, right? So we've talked about, people naturally do this or they do that. caregiving in and of itself takes so much energy because while Kolbe's one part of the mind, the affective is how you feel about things can be so deep in this journey. And so you're expending so much energy there. And I think, that's one of the reasons that caregiving is exhausting is that it is hard. And so if you can make it a little bit easier by getting people to work when they can in their natural mode of operations. But also, I think, it gives you a good, respect for the person that you're caring for if you can just plan for things. So, like, we knew that it might take 3 meetings for Nan with the pulse form.
Mhm.
It stops it from becoming an emergency because it's like, oh my gosh, I thought we were signing it here. I thought we were signing it here.
Right, yeah, she never completed that, right, yeah. I
So
agree totally agree with that, like, I knew she was gonna need it, and so I made sure that we kept doing it so that we didn't get into that crisis and didn't have her have made a decision.
Right. So, and because you, like you said earlier, you were able to follow her process, you were sure that that's what she
Mhm,
wanted. And I think that's really powerful here too, for people to understand is that you can use it to kind of like stop a crisis, right? Like if you know that somebody's higher on the implementer and maybe higher in the fact finder, they're probably going to have to visit facilities. They're going to have to
mhm.
walk around.
Touch it,
Um,
feel it. Mhm,
Exactly. That's really important. Even something as small as, Nan, when she would buy clothes, at the end, she really only bought them from LL Bean because she knew what they were going to feel like when they got there.
mhm,
Right. But like, it would be a really big deal to like go on oldnavy.com and order her a pair of sweatpants, even if they were the ones that she looked like she wanted. If they came and they didn't feel right, she wasn't wearing them.
nope, she was not.
And so you could be really frustrated about that, and God knows we were. Or you could just call LL Bean and buy her the same 4 pairs of pants that she's already wearing that we know that she likes the feel of.
Mhm.
Because there is a reality here
Well, and thank
of
God to LL Bean that they still let her call, that she didn't have to
yes,
do it online. I have to shout out to LL
yes,
Bean for their phone service. It was really,
yes.
really helpful to us.
No, for sure. Um,
And to her.
And I think, because I think there's a reality here of she just couldn't go to a store anymore.
Mhm,
Like that you get to a point where like you tried, right? Like we would put that in and we would take her and we would let her like walk around in like shoes. You also, I mean, there's a reality of you may have to buy 4 different pairs of shoes and send 3 of them back. And
mhm,
you can get really frustrated about that. But that was how like we kind of circumvented this whole she needed option. She needed to touch them. Some of this is the effective, right? Some of this
mhm.
we can't entirely blame on Kolbe,
Right.
but I
No,
think
that's true.
I think like, how better off would you be to know that like I'm going to buy these 4 and I'm just going to put it in my calendar and I'm going to have time to take them back to UPS and send them back when she doesn't like these 3.
Mhm.
Now, bigger issue when you ordered 4 and she didn't like any of them, but and that's the affective. We're not blaming Colby there,
Yeah.
but I think, some of this is about in caregiving stopping crises before they happen.
Mhm.
And some of that planning really can come through Colby and understanding what they're going to need to get there.
Yeah, I mean, the caregiving journey is hard for anybody, and if we can help people better understand themselves and the people that they love, and what that journey is gonna look like, I think then, it's a success.
So, if you're interested in the Colby, if you go to the planningandprotecting.com site, you can feel free to sign up to take the Colby for yourself. If you've never done a Colby at all and this is kind of new to you, I really encourage for you to do it to yourself
Right,
first.
and get
Uh,
the report and see, how it feels.
Yeah. And then, if this is something that you wanted to extend to the person that you're caring for and different things like that, I think really great. So hopping on, planningandprotecting.com to take the Colby. There's, kind of on the website, there's a Colby section. So you can go there and you can take it and you can get the report sent to you for you to review. If, this has been interesting and this is the first time you're kind of listening to us, we encourage you to follow us along on TikTok, on Instagram, on Facebook at the Hey Woman Podcast. If you've never been to the planningandprotecting.com site, it's a really great great resource. It has all of our old episodes. It has lists of attorneys in different states. If you feel like you might need an attorney to help you on your journey, there's also all kinds of free resources on there that I think are really great and can be helpful. It's also the best way to kind of reach out to us. There's contact information there if you have questions or anything like that. But we so appreciate you listening in as we talked about Kolbe, and hopefully this helps you navigate the ups and downs of caregiving.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.